Hi, my name is Mia Mulvey, and I'm an artist living in Denver, Colorado. I'm also a professor of studio art at the University of Denver. My sculptural artworks deal with issues of remoteness, climate, geological, and ecological time as evidenced by the landscape through forms such as ice, ancient trees, and geology. I undertake field research to collect landscapes, map, and explore materials. I'm interested in the ability of memory to be bound in layers and forms in the landscape. Ultimately, my artworks are links to time and to processes still unfolding. I've been lucky enough to undertake field research and travel to Scandinavia, Poland, the Arctic Circle, and throughout the Western US. One of the techniques I use, in addition to traditional sculptural techniques, is photogrammetry. So, photogrammetry is a way to generate digital 3D scans of forms. It takes still images and a computer program runs through. It's all about measuring and distance to create these digital scans. I kind of think of it as a low-tech, high-tech way of 3D scanning because my favorite tools are my iPhone or even my iPad. One of the reasons that I utilize photogrammetry and 3D scanning is to honor the ground truth of different locations. It's a way for me to sculpturally record and investigate the environment, a way to see. I am very conscious of the impact on the land. Travel certainly has its own issues, but I'm very conscious of my interface with the landscape, specifically ancient trees. A lot of these are scientific specimens, often gated off or inaccessible. And so 3D scanning is an easy way to cast or make a mold of the surface without having to physically touch or impact the specimen. In some cases, I've been lucky enough to get permission to actually clay on the surface, and that's one of the traditional techniques that I use, where I can backpack out with clay, lay it on the surface, and peel it off without leaving any kind of residue. Then I can transport those physical casts back to the studio. The reason I use digital techniques most of the time and in the studio is I like to think of it as my hand is in it, but my fingerprints are not. I'm very interested in honoring the science as well as poetic interpretation, and I'm very interested in the idea of the real. I use these digital techniques in tandem with traditional ones in the studio. Sometimes that's due to scale and sometimes concept. So one of the things that I do in the studio is I do a lot of 3D printing. And so these scans can be altered or changed or scaled, a variety of different things. And then I can 3D print them mostly in clay. I think most people are familiar with plastic 3D printing, where plastic is melted and extruded in a coiling, building up layers through repetition. So I use something similar, but I print with clay, a soft paste. I've also explored printing in lots of different materials, such as glass powder and even salt. I'm very interested in the combination of science and art, and I try to use the tools that reflect my process. So even 3D printing, building things up in layers is very similar to how a tree records time and creates that catalog of memories of the environment. So for example, Pando is a collective whole. It's a clonal aspen colony located in Utah, and it's estimated to be 80,000 years old. And as a clonal tree, it's not what you see above the ground. Those individual trees live to be 100, 150 years old, but it's that collective whole that really shows that great age. And 3D printing has been a good way for me to talk about both the individuality of the trees as well as the whole through that slow accumulation. So 3D printing is that slow, repetitive layering over and over, just like a tree would grow, building up, taking in that mark of time and the mark of process. I was also able just recently to visit Prometheus, which is a bristlecone pine in Nevada at the Great Basin National Park. It is 4,900 years old, thereabout, or it was. It was accidentally cut down in 1964. It was cut down by permission, but they didn't know quite the age, and so it was only after sampling it after the tree was cut that they realized that it was the oldest tree that had been known at the time. One of the interesting things about traveling to different sites is that each location tells a different story, but there are also similarities. So if you look at something on a larger time scale, on the ideas of deep time, there are a lot of overlaps. So for example, I was able to travel to Svalbard, which is in the Arctic Circle, doing a residency with some other artists. And I was there to 3D scan ice specifically, something else that records time through layering, much like trees. But I was there walking across the glacial moraine, and amongst the rocks were, hundreds of fossils of leaves, ginkgo and other deciduous trees, from a time period when the rocks and their surfaces were much closer to the equator and the environment was very, very different. Same thing in Nevada, the Great Basin National Park. I was there to explore the bristlecone pines, and yet I was right next to, almost on top of, and actually had to hike through a glacial moraine. It's one of the last glaciers in Nevada. So these are all, I seek out places and locations where dramatic events have occurred or compressed and worn away. And I think these landscapes remember these details of timescales near and far, and it's really that shift in perspective, looking at things from our timescale, trees, the rocks, those different timescales open things up, and you start to see the layers become markers of change. Another concept that I'm very interested in is the idea of wonder. So wonder is an active space between not knowing and knowing. And it's through the experience of wonder that really one can gain knowledge and understanding of these time scales of past and present. And I think it's really important to explore visual perspectives of issues of geology, ecology, and climate. Ultimately, they foster empathy and understanding and a greater investment in the world. Thank you so much for spending time with me and listening. Bye-bye.